Alrighty. Welcome to my funny little podcast here. Uh, Today I want to talk about nationality and concepts of nationality and nationhood within the Soviet Union. And those sort of topics have always really interested me just because of how explosive and powerful outbursts of national consciousness can be. And despite its connotations as an archaic concept and one that's supposedly been forgotten in the West, we see the specter of nationalism rear its head in a lot of diverse places around the world and at home. And as we'll see with regards to the Soviet Union, nationalism actually had a hand with its eventual dissolution. Specifically for this podcast, however, I want to talk about being Soviet in the context of it as an identity. So, something that pops up from time to time in the readings and appeals by Soviet leaders and documents. There's sort of references to a Soviet people, an overarching Soviet identity, which is odd in a way, given the immense diversity within the Soviet Union and the ideological desire of Marxism to sort of erase nations and replace them with a common proletarian mass. So I wanted to know whether, or sort of explore whether Soviet leaders had any political will to enforce a monolithic, overarching identity, and if they did, to what extent was that policy carried out, and was there any strong adherence to that over actual particularist national identities? As well, I wanted to take this podcast, or use this podcast to examine different means through which nations are formed, and whether any of those avenues can be applied to the Soviet situation, because nations have been forged even with the obstacle of differing and competing ethnicities. Supranationalities like British and Spanish are really good examples of that, as well as the colonial nations that popped out of the British Empire and places like Switzerland or even India. There's potential to create a nation where there is division. So yeah, essentially for this podcast, I want to examine Soviet identity and the Soviet approach to nationalities, and examine the different approaches to nation formation that can be applied to this particular case. And then finally, I think it's maybe worthwhile to outline why I think the Soviet Union may have gotten close, but I don't think it really ever could form a cohesive national identity and sort of demarcate the challenges that stood in the way of that sort of promised goal of Marxism to eliminate all nationalities and replace it by one sort of overarching proletarian mass. So a good place to begin, I think, is by situating ourselves in the discourse on nations and nationalism, as well as outlining the Marxist approach to nationalities that the leaders of the Soviet Union were sort of obliged to ideologically follow. So what then is a nation? So nation has its roots in the Latin word natio or nationem, which is used in reference to groups in the sense of originating or being born from a common root. In this way, nation can be used sort of synonymously with ethnic group, as both refer to a people united primarily by common descent, as well as language, religion, customs, and territory. The question then is, what's the difference? So there are thousands of ethnic groups globally, but likely only a few hundred nations, so what's the distinction? The difference, I believe at least, is that nations are sort of the evolution of ethnicity politicized, or political ethnicity. So nations are ethnic groups that are politically actualized. Ethnic groups can be genetically and anthropologically identified and categorized, even if they're unable to come to these conclusions as a group. But nations, in addition to being genetically and anthropologically identified and categorized, have the sort of self-conception of togetherness and politically agitate for their interests as a nation, which is similar in some capacities to Benedict Anderson's imagined communities. But what is different there, I think, is that it really should be emphasized that there's a bedrock of common descent that belies this sort of feeling of togetherness and a common fate. It's tangible. It's not just within the people's consciousness. But I sort of preempted myself here. There are a couple of interpretations of what nations are and how they came to be, and chief among them is the modernist school of nationalism. So the modernist or modernization school was developed in the wake of nationalism's destructive path waged during the Second World War, And this is the school of thought that's adopted by many in academia today. Many of the scholars who contributed to this area, such as Hobsbawm and Gellner, were European Jews who were sort of the products of that conflict. Their thinking was sort of directly or indirectly affected by the nationalist attitudes that drove that conflict, and it sort of pushed their ideas down a constructivist path. So, modernization theory sort of posits that national identity arose directly as a result of the modernizing influences of like the 17th through the 19th century. So, it was only possible through technological and philosophical innovations at the time for nations to be created. At face value, this is a plausible assertion. Benedict Anderson points to the invention of the printing press and its invaluable role in not only increasing access to books, but books specifically written in local vernacular. So think Bibles written in local languages like English or Scottish, or sorry, like Gaelic or German. So nations were able to write about themselves in their own languages, as opposed to the sort of universalist Latin. As well, further along the line from printing presses, once newspapers and other print media became widely available, it even further increased access to resources of a primary national language, which sort of further fostered cohesion across the state into a unified national identity. Transportation became easier as steamships and locomotives made trips across and between countries much easier and faster, which led to further interconnectivity within countries and sort of the breakdown of parochial identities. Increased urbanization forced peasants into close proximity with each other, which, in conjunction with things like mass education imposed by the elites in a national language and a conscription in a national army, think the levée en masse of the French Revolution, that sort of forced a national consciousness into being. Now finally, the fundamental truths of society, such as the primacy of religion and the divine right of kings to govern, were sort of being questioned and challenged, which opened the door for new forms of political legitimacy to be given by the people and executed by the people. So, in a way, it was in some parts a top-down endeavor and imposition by societal elites, and that's sort of seen through the educational aspects and the militaristic aspects, but it was done also in conjunction with the the innovations of the time. Sort of those technological innovations forced national identities to form because they so drastically upended the traditional parochial state of society. Those are very good points that modernists make, but I feel that it ignores a lot of historical examples of national consciousness and political ethnicity that have existed since, as far back as antiquity. We can see outbursts of national consciousness without the trappings of modernity to unleash them. And which is why I posit that nations have actually existed well before modernity, and modernity instead simply amplified existing national consciousness. So for example, we can think of the ancient Greeks, which are a fantastic example, and the Greeks of antiquity, where they were a collection of divided and bickering polities, but even still, they still had a sense of shared culture, they had a shared national religion, and that's really important because that sort of upends Anderson's assertion that there wasn't really any means of transmitting information across such a large area to be able to form a national consciousness. That doesn't really account for national religions such as the Norse religion, and of course the Greek religion, and Sumerian religion, which we'll get to as well. So how were those religions able to propagate themselves and spread that cultural influence if the modern influence that or the modern innovations that allowed the broad dissemination of things like that wasn't possible? So they had that shared pantheon and extensive kinship ties, and they viewed Greeks overall as superior to barbarians of other ethnic groups. They explicitly placed Greeks, however divided they may have been, in relation to other ethnic groups. This is demonstrated well in Plato's Republic, where during one of the Socratic dialogues, there's an explicit mention of the Greeks as a group in relation to barbarians. And Socrates says, I quote, "When Greeks do battle with barbarians, or barbarians with Greeks, we'll say that they're natural enemies. But when Greeks fight with Greeks, we'll say that they are natural friends, and that in such circumstances Greece is sick and divided, and that such hostilities are to be called civil war." And he notes as well that, I quote, "The Greek race is its own and akin, but it is strange and foreign to barbarians." End quote. So there was a self-conception, despite that political division, of Greekness well before the forces of modernity were sort of brought to bear. And I think the best expression of Greek political ethnicity would be the Greco-Persian War, where despite the divided nature of Greek politics, most city-states joined either a coalition against Persia or remained neutral. Some did side with the Persians, but following the war, there were charges of Medism, which is Persians sympathizing, that were leveled against those Greeks, and they were sort of punished accordingly. So, in spite of their differences, the threat of the other made Greeks that they realize that they had a lot in common as, what we would probably account as a nation. This sort of pattern can be replicated with Sumer, which is the similar sort of collection of city-states, divided politically, weren't united, but they had a shared culture, pantheon, extensive kinship ties, and this series of city-states fell to Sargon of Akkad several thousand years ago. But once Sargon died, the people of Sumer, the peasantry, independent of their elites, revolted and attempted to expel the occupiers. So what compelled them to do this? If they only had parochial identities, or even just civic identities to their city, what would compel them to try and overthrow a foreign ruler, that ruled over the entirety of Sumerian civilization? I would argue that that's an expression of political ethnicity, of nationalism. So they were illiterate peasants, and they should have passively accepted Akkadian rule, but, because oppressive kings are oppressive kings, but instead, they fought back independent of their elites. So there are a lot of other examples. We can think of Egypt, which had its own national religion, set territory, common descent narrative, but there are also a lot of examples outside of antiquity, such as in the medieval and early modern periods. We can think of the English nation being talked about as early as 731 AD, with Bede's Ecclesiastical History of England, and the Hussite religious reformist movement had a very distinct bohemian character to it. So we can see that nations existed definitely well before modernists posit that they did, but then this sort of raises the question of, well, where did they come from? If not originating out of modernity, where did nations originate? So there's a very good book by the political scientist Azar Gat, so Nations, the Long History and Deep Roots of Political Ethnicity and Nationalism, and the sort of theory there is that we have to trace human political evolution well back into our tribal days. So a lot of the first societies that existed began sort of as tribal and hunter-gatherer groups. So these societies, the societies that originated out of that, would have been made up of local tribes sort of congregating, sharing cultural experiences, celebrating shared beliefs and rituals, and most importantly, intermarrying between each other, which would sort of lay the groundwork for extensive kinship ties that would create the first ethnic groups. So ethnic groups and nations, sort of successively, are essentially the logical extension of kinship ties from family to community to the general ethnic space at large. Thus, there's sort of like a decreasing scale of affinity from family to stranger, with an individual being most closely connected to their immediate family, then their extended family and community, their broad ethnic space, and then the other. So Azar Gat sort of sums it up with a Bedouin proverb, which is, I against my brother and I against my cousin, but my brother, cousin, and I against the world. So what are the takeaways then? For this podcast, essentially, it's good to note that most nations are just very old, centuries. Some maybe even a little more. But even with that, it's good to note that nations are also constantly in flux. Primordialists, which is one of the other schools, sort of harp on about this sort of immutable characteristics of nations, and they sort of posit a continuation from one point to another, which in some capacities is true, but in others, culture is sort of a continually evolving affair. But the foundational kinship realities that underlie ethnicity and nationhood are ever present. What else is useful for this analysis is that modernity served primarily to amplify the national consciousness already present within societies. Modernity sort of allowed peasants to congregate with similar ethnic kin. They understood their similarities and where they stood in society. And modernity also allowed them to become acquainted or cognizant of the other. It allowed dissemination of, foreign sort of works and foreign propaganda and such that allow people to see that they shared more similarities with those around them than they did with those outside their borders. So it kind of solidified that already existing kinship bond. It's also good to note that kinship bonds are just very strong themselves, and kin preference likely offers some explanation for the resilience of nations in the face of oppression, and why nations are just such powerful ideas, and why people are willing to kill, they're willing to die for their nation. In a similar sort of vein, I want to point to a 2013 paper that I found published by McGill University researchers, which sort of reinforces that idea of the strength of national and ethnic consciousness. It simulated evolutionary group strategies. So strategies such as ethnocentrism, which of course is cooperation within an ethnic group against other ethnic groups. There's humanism, which is cooperation between ethnic groups. And then there are selfish and traitorous strategies, which is the hoarding of resources and the active aiding and abetting of an othered ethnic group to the detriment of your own. So through random starts, ethnocentrism came to dominate the other three evolutionary strategies, as it sort of exploited the weaknesses that were afforded by cooperation between ethnic groups, and it exploited the traitorous behavior of those who attempted to betray their ethnic group to another. So again, this sort of reinforces that there's a lot of strength in kinship bonds, which are the foundation of ethnic identity. In the face of the other, the extended ethnic space, read extended kinship group, must be protected, and often it is protected to the death. So with that out of the way, I want to move now to sort of the Marxist approach to nationalism. So for Marx, the imposition of capital and private property on society sort of allows alienation to arise that creates divisions in the form of nations. So similar to modernization theory, nations are influenced heavily by their elites and also social forces. So Marx's bourgeoisie sort of made nations sort of became a top-down imposition by the national bourgeoisie to confuse the general population, to sort of make them ignorant or apathetic to their common proletarian interests. This isn't to say that Marx didn't recognize the importance of nations and nationhood to the populace, but he understood that nations were the tools of capital, and not necessarily inherent to man's nature. Or at least that's the assertion. It's not that this would have mattered much to his analysis regardless, because communism is sort of the triumph of man over natural constrictions. So nations would be revolutionary stepping stones to usher in the penultimate stage of history, capitalism, to which communism would follow once the proletarian body of people recognized their inherent interests and seized political power from the national bourgeoisie. So with the achievement of communism, national and class distinctions would fade away, replaced by the homogeneous working masses. So that's the end goal, the complete dissolution of national distinctions. But as we can see, though, this lofty goal wasn't obtained in the Soviet Union, as nationalities existed and thrived through its formation. They survived the Stalinist period and came out through the other side as the Soviet Union collapsed. So that sort of poses the question of what were the Soviet policies on nationalities, and why was there sort of a disconnect between them and the universalizing dogma of Marxism? So, Soviet nationality policies were born out of necessity in the Russian Civil War, and that experience informed, I think, much of Lenin's initial approach to the constituent nationalities of the former Russian Empire. As I'm sure you're aware, the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917 after 3 grueling years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front. A provisional government was installed after the Tsar's abdication, and that provisional government is couped later in the year, which sparks the Civil War. The Soviets are pretty barbaric in their initial advances on former imperial territory. There are passages in General Wrangel's memoirs that sort of speak of prisons being liberated and those convicts joining the Bolsheviks and committing just unspeakable mass looting, killing, and rape. Doctors, lawyers, anyone thought to be traitors to the revolution were just straight up shot. So the Bolsheviks left a very poor impression on the populace once they assumed control in the early 20s. As well, the Bolsheviks were thought of as a continuation of Russian authority by the smaller nationalities of the empire. So to increase that legitimacy and to bring those nationalities on side and damage the reputation of the whites, Lenin and Stalin both made statements professing to the right of nations to self-determination. And upon seizing power, one of the first Bolshevist proclamations is made to that effect. And it read, if any nation whatsoever is forcibly retained within the boundaries of a given state, if, in spite of its expressed desire, no matter whether that desire expressed in the press, at popular meetings, in party decisions, or in the protest and revolts against national oppression, it is not permitted the right to decide the forms of its state existence by a free vote, then such incorporation is annexation, i.e. seizure and coercion. And further motions in this regard are passed at party meetings. So this allowed the Soviets to gain legitimacy with those nationalities and focus entirely on the whites, whose forces were concentrated in areas dominated by non-Russian ethnic groups. General Wrangel and General Denikin were concentrated in the Caucasus and Crimea, which was home to the Tatars, Caucasian people, Kalmyks, and more. And Kolchak was concentrated in Siberia, which is diverse with Turkic and Siberian people. Stalin admits himself that, and I quote, "Do not forget that if in the rear of Kolchak, Denikin, Wrangel, and Yudenich we had not had the so-called aliens, if we had not had the former oppressed peoples who undermined the rear of those generals by their silent sympathies with the Russian proletariat, and this, comrades, is a special factor in our growth, this silent sympathy, nobody sees or hears it, but it decides everything. If it had not been for this sympathy, we should not have beaten one of these generals." So once power is consolidated over the whites, however, secession is still nominally legal for means of legitimacy, but it's also viewed as an expression of bourgeois nationalism, which is traitorous to the revolution. So it was out of necessity that this recognition of nations emerged, and this sort of sets the stage for nationality policy through the Lenin years and even into the early Stalin years. The Soviets, at least in the moment, realize that they're stuck with nationalities, and they need to consolidate and begin the march to communism, they need to respect that autonomy. So this leads to what some have called the affirmative action empire, or korenizatsiya. So korenizatsiya was a set of modernization policies instituted by the Soviet Union within its constituent republics, and following the Civil War, society had to be reconstructed. And in doing so, the Bolsheviks hoped to modernize the republics socially, industrially, politically, and economically, so across all spectrum of society. So there were mass literacy campaigns across the Soviet Union in local vernaculars, the intended effect of which was to create party elites and professionals drawn from the local population to govern themselves, but in accordance with the party line, of course. Quotas were established for educational institutions and workplaces to integrate those constituent nations, and it was sort of an odd break with Marxist orthodoxy, as it sort of seems antithetical to the whole no more nations thing, to actively uplift nations and actively encourage their cultural development within society. But this was again done out of pragmatism. It was adopted to further appease the ethnicities of the Soviet Union, so that way it wouldn't be seen just as the continuation of Russian domination of their territory, as things had been during the empire. So the Soviet Union, at the time, needed legitimacy, and this is where they found it. The issue, which will be touched on later, draws back to an earlier point about the effects of modernization on a society. These nations and ethnicities already existed and had strong national sentiments, but the extension of modernity to these backward locales was likely a double-edged sword that further solidified national consciousness in its constituent republics. Lenin's policies were antithetical to Marxist universalism and brought the Soviet Union nowhere closer to achieving a nationless society. But Stalin's ascension to power brought an end to the empowering influence of Korenizatsiya, and it sort of ushered in the beginnings of some semblance of an overarching Soviet identity. So, by this point, with Stalin's takeover, the Soviet Union's hold over the former imperial territories was pretty well secured at this point. So, the empowerment of the titular nationalities was no longer necessary for the security of the state. Stalin also sought to aggressively centralize the Soviet Union to its heart in Moscow through violent collectivization and industrialization. So, the decentralized Korenizatsiya policies were kind of a liability in that regard and a roadblock to his ambitions, and the rights that people enjoyed under the policies were curtailed. As part of Stalin's purges, many of the national communists that were put in place by Korenizatsiya were killed or ousted, with Russians often being put in those positions. Great Russian chauvinism, so that just means Russian chauvinism, was previously a crime in the Soviet Union under Lenin, but it returned in some capacities with Stalin, as Stalin professed a very weird affection for the Russian people, which is odd considering his Georgian ancestry. But the Russians were the first among equals, or a big brother in a fraternal union of brotherly republics. In Stalin's own words, old Russia has been transformed into today's USSR, where all peoples are identical. Among the equal nations, states, and countries of the USSR, the most Soviet and the most revolutionary is the Russian nation. Russia was the fatherland. Russia was the Rodina. These would sort of all come to the forefront when war loomed over the Soviet Union in the 30s, and before, during, and after the World War, the Soviet Union would deport a bunch of different ethnicities thought to be unreliable and disloyal to different parts of the Soviet Union. When Japan invaded China in 1937, they deported Koreans and Chinese into Central Asia, and when the eastern borderlands, the Kresy of Poland, was taken, and Lithuania and the rest of the Baltics annexed, many Poles and Baltic peoples were deported to the steppes. So this was a way of sort of breaking some national identities within the Soviet state, and this was continued with education, as education was continued in national languages, but Russian was made mandatory to ensure standardized lingua franca across the Soviet Union. Though there was nominal equality officially, unofficially, there was a present hierarchy of nations, with Russia at the forefront. Stalin was attempting to actualize a Soviet identity project through and through, but the characteristics of this identity were thoroughly Russian. And the Great Patriotic War provided further fuel for the supranational experiment, as other nationalisms were cracked down upon by the Stalinist regime. Now, Khrushchev did also have a nationality policy aimed at creating a pan-Soviet identity, and he continued some of the Russification policies and purges of national elites in Central Asia, the Baltics, and the Caucasus. However, the beginning of his leadership of the Soviet Union was actually marked by greater autonomy given to the constituent nationalities of the Union. Economic power was delegated away from the center into the republics, giving them an increased say in running their republics and giving them increased control over cultural matters. Interestingly, Khrushchev was especially lenient with the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, throwing a lavish celebration of the tercentenary of Khmelnytsky's rebellion against the Poles and the accepting of Russian suzerainty. Overtures were made to the Ukrainians, obviously rhetorically, but the ownership of the Crimean Peninsula was also transferred to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic as a gesture of goodwill. Thus, it was the intermediary years where power was returned over cultural issues to the Republic that Stalin's progress towards a pan-Soviet identity was hindered. But harsh Russification policies were revived by Khrushchev after he secured his position at the top of the political hierarchy against Malenkov, Molotov, and Zhukov. Reforms to the educational system, which allowed parents to choose whether their children were to be educated in their native tongue or Russian, allowed a linguistic Russification to take place, seeing as many universities and well-paying careers were only open to those who could speak Russian. This Russification was done to great effect, especially in the East Slavic portions of the Soviet Union, Belarus and Ukraine. Between 1951 and 1956, the percentage of students in Ukrainian language schools dropped from 81 to 65%, while those studying Russian saw an increase in the same period to 31% from 18. In Minsk, 90% of students were taking no classes in Belarusian by the end of the 1960s. So, despite ideological divides, when Brezhnev took office upon ousting Khrushchev, he actually maintained much of the same policies and, in some cases, took an even stricter line. For example, a directive was issued ordering that all graduate theses be written in Russian and approved in Moscow. And in 1979, the authorities organized an all-union conference in Tashkent to improve Russian language instruction. And as well, in 1983, bonuses were paid to teachers of Russian in schools with non-Russian language instruction, sort of incentivizing that teachers teach Russian as opposed to other languages. But what this all leads to is that by the time Gorbachev takes office in 1985, the number of non-Russian Russian speakers is close to 70 million people, and the vast majority of those are concentrated in Belarus and Ukraine. 75 million people proclaimed no proficiency in Russian, all of whom were concentrated in the areas outside of that East Slavic area. So these East Slavs were increasingly identifying with Russian linguistically, which is sort of a good marker for identification with this Russified Soviet identity. So East Slavs were some of the most receptive to Russification campaigns, but outside of there, the national policies of the Soviet Union had no effect, largely. These other republics were pretty content to remain tied to their titular nationality, and they really had little desire to immerse themselves in a Russified Soviet identity. And this, I think, has implications for the ability of the Soviet Union to actually create a unified and cohesive national identity. And this sort of follows the same kinship and common ancestry arguments that I've been referring to when talking about nationhood. You can see that because Belarusians and Ukrainians originated from a similar common ancestor as Russians, and they developed in similar capacities, follow the same religious tradition, and speak a similar enough language, it makes assimilation into, a dominant supranationality very easy. So we'll get to that a little later, but I did just want to return to the progress of the Soviet nation in Russia and get to Gorbachev, our final leader, who, kind of ruined everything in a way. So, as we know through the class, Gorbachev instituted perestroika and glasnost reforms, which, while well-intentioned, sort of gave nationalists within those non-East Slavic areas, even within the East Slavic areas, the ability to espouse their nationalist ideas with little interference from the central government. And obviously we can see the effects of that, where allowing nationalists in the Baltics and in the Caucasus to sort of take hold and not combating that effectively, it sort of shattered the illusion that a Soviet nationality could be possible across the Soviet Union. And as well, it sort of opened the door for the progress being made in Russifying the East Slavic portions of the Soviet Union. It kind of rendered that progress moot, because now nationalists in those areas, especially Western Ukraine, which was annexed from Poland before the Second, or during the Second World War, it allowed nationalists in those areas to really voice their concerns unimpeded, which, as we can see, led in part to the final dissolution of the Soviet Union and sort of the death of any dream of a pan-Soviet nationality. So now I kind of want to talk about, direct our discussion towards whether a Soviet nation was actually feasible and what sort of form that might take. And I've dropped hints during the conversation so far as to those sort of forms that could be expected and that could be successful. And the first one I want to touch on is the supra-identity sort of model. I think this might be one of the more realistic ones, and it's something that I think Khrushchev and Brezhnev's tenures, if given more time, would have eventually developed. And super-identity is essentially an identity that is a level above the nation. It is a national identity, but one that is sort of a combination of sort of interrelated identities. Um, the best examples of this are the British supranational identity and the Spanish supranational identity. Now, um, obviously, the British one I think is probably the most well known. It was an entire empire that had its name, and the British identity is obviously it's made out of an English ethnic core, which I think is a really important distinction to make. That is not so much completely equal ethnicities that make up a supranational identity, but rather there's sort of a core national identity that it's based around. That sort of gives the foundational character to that supranational identity, and then other identities sort of identify with that um, on a relatively equal footing. So with a British case, we can think of the Scottish and the Welsh as being part of that sort of supranational British identity, and they aren't quite equal contributors to that identity, but they're sort of partaking in that in addition to their actual national identities. And we can see that it's been relatively successful because, you know, this sort of idea of a British nation still exists. The United Kingdom sort of, they refer to themselves as British in sort of a general abstract way. Um, Obviously, we're heading more into rocky territory these days, as there seems to be less and less tying those other nationalities to the British supranationality. And this sort of emphasizes just how central being the English identity is to British identity, in that you don't really see the English trying to succeed from the United Kingdom. It's those other less equal nationalities. And I think this speaks to something that was an issue during the Soviet collapse, which is that once I suppose the economic conditions that make a union like that worthwhile no longer are no longer there, it sort of lessens the desire to remain in that union, and it sort of heightens the desire to want to go one's own way nationally. And we can sort of see that now, where Britain has been downgraded over the past several decades from being an empire to being a major player in Europe to now just not having as much influence and economic heft as they used to be, being overshadowed by players on the continent, players in Asia, players in North America. So there seems to be less and less that is sort of incentivizing people to stay within that sort of, or identifying with that supranational identity. So we'll see how that shakes out. And with regards to the Spanish identity, the situation is a little similar, where you have a Castilian ethnic core that sort of forms the body of this Spanish supranational identity, and then there's sort of orbiting nations. You can think Galician, Catalan, that are from the same common ancestry and share similar linguistic, linguistic similarities and a sort of a common religion, and that makes it a lot easier to integrate within this sort of supranationality. But similar, in a way, to what's happening to the British supranationality at the moment, is that there's becoming less of an incentive to remain within that system and to identify with that identity. And we see that especially with the sort of separatist leanings professed by the Catalonians. So just like the British, we'll have to see how that shakes out. But this seems to be one of the few avenues through which sort of a more cohesive national model within the Soviet Union could be possible, as the majority of the Soviet Union's population was East Slavic. Without a doubt, it was obviously already a majority Russian, and then you compound that with several million Belarusians and Ukrainians, and you have an East Slavic sort of almost super majority. And it, as we can see, it would be fairly easy, given enough time and enough economic incentive, to be able to form sort of a supranational Soviet identity based around these Slavic areas with a Russian ethnic core, serving as a sort of like a cultural, linguistic bedrock to this supranationality. And that was what was happening under Brezhnev and Khrushchev, and something that could have continued had the reforms of Glasnost and Perestroika not given a voice to nationalist concerns. Well, for good or for bad, that can be debated, but realistically, that would have continued. And another prerequisite outside of just there being no Glasnost and Perestroika to feed these national concerns is that the Soviet economy continues not necessarily being good, but being stable enough to provide those economic incentives that make a supranational union and identity sort of stable and possible. So long as good positions are available in respectable professions in the nomenclatura, you can expect, and so long as obviously those positions require Russian language skills as a prerequisite to being given that position, you can expect to see people continually adopting the Russian language and eventually assimilating into that supranational identity over time. One of the other options I did want to consider was also sort of an American style process of nation building, and whether that could be applied to the Soviet Union. And I think it's probably a little less, actually a lot less realistic than the supranational model, but it is a little more encompassing, because America was principally, Anglophone for a lot of its history, and then it accepted small amounts of immigrants from different countries, and those immigrants pretty well dispersed themselves in such a way that assimilation to the broader Anglo culture of the United States was possible. Obviously, you have some exceptions of, say, the Pennsylvania Dutch, which are German-speaking settlers in Pennsylvania, and they still do continue to maintain their traditions even to this day. But Americans of all different European ethnic backgrounds are pretty fairly indistinguishable from each other today. And you got to wonder if something like that is actually possible, would be possible in the Soviet Union. And I think you run into some problems which are sort of inherent with the Soviet Union's geography and how ethnic groups are dispersed. Because America, I think, was able to assimilate those populations easily because they weren't... they left their own homeland to go to another, and they're completely detached from that homeland and from, their ethnic fellows. They do make ghettos, they do make, close-knit communities, but ultimately over time, there's no real attachment to their homeland that they can maintain. And so they're able to assimilate freely into American society over a period of time. This is not so much the case with the Soviet Union, because the geography there is just a lot more complex, and I think the diversity of ethnicities and nations is just so much more potent than in the United States. The United States only really had to deal, up until recently, with European immigrants, which would be much more easy to assimilate than Russia's plethora of Caucasian people, Asians, Europeans, Jews, all sorts of different ethnic groups of completely different backgrounds that are already in their own homelands. They aren't leaving their homelands to go to a place that disconnects them from there. They are there, and the only way that I can foresee assimilation working is to follow sort of a Stalinist plan of deportations across the Soviet Union and thinning out the numbers enough that they're sort of forced to assimilate within the broader ethnic community that they've been placed in. Obviously, completely unethical and immoral, but that's the only way something like that could work, as it has in sort of an American way. So ultimately, that doesn't seem too feasible for the Soviet Union to have accomplished. Definitely, the supranationality seems to be the more realistic of the two models. So, to conclude, it seems as though an all-encompassing Soviet identity was tried, and Soviet leaders did make actionable attempts to try and assimilate parts of the Soviet Union into a Russified Soviet nation. At the end of the day, however, I believe that there still couldn't really have been a Soviet nation, at least not one that didn't leave large elements of the Soviet populace outside of the overarching identity. So, the extension of minority and national rights to the Soviet Union, and the solidification of that, and the expectation of that, already forms sort of a roadblock that is difficult to overcome when on the path of nation building. Whether publications get banned, or books censored, or historical events labeled immoral or mischaracterized, the people largely still do remember what came before, though they may not speak it. Kolonizatsiya uplifted Soviet nationalities, and even with double-down Russification through Khrushchev and Brezhnev's tenures, elements of it still did remain, and national communists eventually regained their positions of power by the time Gorbachev takes over as leader. Pandora's box essentially was opened, and it didn't help the Soviets that part of the Union that they annexed around the Great Patriotic War was virulently nationalistic, such as Western Ukraine, which had to deal with many years of Polish oppression, and the Baltics, who had finally enjoyed 20 years of independence from larger states. As well, the prestige and legitimacy gained from offering autonomy to constituent peoples was necessary to save face for the Soviet Union, as it passed itself off as an anti-colonial superpower. And an anti-colonial superpower can't really be seen as assimilating other ethnic groups into a larger identity group. As well, the common ancestry necessary to form a cohesive nation simply just didn't exist outside of the East Slavic areas of the Union. There was incredible diversity in ethnicity, and very little in common, which leaves not a lot in place to jumpstart a nation-building enterprise. Language Russification can only really get so far, and it was only successful for the East Slavs because of underlying relations by way of things like common ancestry and religion. So, with regards to the somewhat realistic supranational identity just discussed, it's rendered more unlikely simply because of the timing that it originated in. The economy slowed down and disintegrated before enough time could really pass that a supranationality composed of the East Slavic portions of the Soviet Union could really be solidified. The economic incentives were just no longer there to make learning Russian, and subsequently identifying with Russian, really worth it to the average Belarusian and Ukrainian. Instead, the muzzle was lifted off of bourgeois national voices through perestroika and glasnost, which, in conjunction with the economic and social problems of Gorbachev's tenure, killed a nascent Soviet identity really in the crib. In short, not enough was done to break the existing nations to assimilate them into a larger Soviet identity, and for the few nations that were really realistically assimilable, the Russification process was simply not started fast enough to ensure solidification of identity before the economic processes of communism broke down. In a way, perhaps Russia really is more like the empires that came before it. Similar to the French and the Portuguese empires, it had sort of a civilizing mission of sorts, which bringing modernization, industrialization, and communism to subordinate nations and ethnic groups that were seen as backwaters. And once that modernization went as far as it could, with the natives having been uplifted and the benefits of the relationship becoming less tangible by the day, disintegration occurred that simply could not be recovered from. And I think on that note, that concludes the podcast, and I'd really like to thank anyone who's listening for tuning in and listening to me ramble on and on. I have to apologize that it went a little over the 45-minute mark, but I really did want to throw out all these ideas of nationhood and nationality, because I think it's really interesting in the context of the Soviet Union, just because of how actually surprisingly serious people were about forming a Soviet nation, and just how they weren't able to see the roadblocks in the way, and just how unfeasible at the end of the day it could have been, mostly because they were just blinded by those sort of ideological goggles of Marxism, and just they weren't able to see just how unrealistic it probably would have been to create an overarching Soviet identity that could withstand the test of time and withstand hard times in the Soviet Union. So thanks again, and thank you for a fantastic semester. I'm Professor Ganiski, if you're listening. Take care.